welcome back to Pastor Plek's podcast. I am your host, Pastor Plek, and with me in the studio is none other than Tony Nelson. Welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Nicole Troup. She is with us in studio. Super excited to have you.
Hey.
And this is a special podcast because I think this is just the day we live in. That I get a ton of questions revolving around sex. What's the line? What can I do? What can I not do? All of that. And so we're going to start. We got Nicole here, single woman, and Tony and I are married men with children. And so this is always going to be a wild time as we talk about this. So let's just kind of walk it through. What is the line when it comes to sex and temptation and what is right? How about that? I'm going to start with Tony and just kind of, you've had conversations like this probably within your community group a lot.
Yeah, recently too.
Okay, hit me. What's the usual framing?
Well, okay, so this typically comes from married guys who are looking to stop looking at pornography, and then they wonder, is it wrong for me to masturbate if I'm thinking about my wife?
Okay, good.
That's the general question. Like they're trying to exit, they're going to put porn aside, but they're like, I still have the habit of masturbation, so I want to reorient it, right?
Good.
So before I hop into like the boundaries, I think it's really important to understand that if people only approach resolving things in a mechanical way, like here's the line that I won't cross,
right,
and they have no idea what Scripture says, they have no idea what the heart behind what Scripture is, what God is trying to communicate to us, then it gets real legalistic, and then they don't understand how to handle new situations whenever they pop up.
Right. I think the big question, and this might frame it just for me personally, is is the thing that I'm doing, or is the sexual activity that I'm engaging in, is it glorifying to God? Is this honoring Him, or is it glorifying me? And I think that becomes ultimately the direction where you have to kind of wrestle that down. Okay, so back to...
Okay, so I'll point to some Scripture first, and then maybe we can talk about this. But the first and obvious one where we'll talk about Scripture does clearly define sexual temptations as sinful in Matthew 5 when it's talking about lust. Specifically, if you're lusting after women that are not your wife, right? Or I guess in your case, Nicole, like after men who you are not married to.
Right. Happens.
And this is Matthew 5:27, where it says, you've heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body and be thrown into hell. Right. And so I'll just kind of stop there. But I think that this is very clearly where Jesus is calling us to a higher standard when it comes to not just in the Old Testament where it said just don't commit adultery, but he's saying it's not even just about the physical act, but it's about where the heart's disposition is. If my heart naturally leans toward having been satisfied by another woman, that's an adulterous thing. Right. And so there is that. But I also think that in 1 Corinthians 7, it does talk about the sexuality, our sexuality belonging to our spouse. Right. And so there's sort of that containment chamber.
That is huge. So what that means is do not deprive your spouse of sex. And that I think in our day and age that sounds very draconian. And like, oh, that must mean that a woman must give it up, or a man for that matter, give it up whenever the other person says, as if. But there's this reality of like it's mutual, like the submission of my body, it's yours. My body is yours, and if you're going to honor the other person, then you're going to give that willingly and lovingly. Yeah. However, I think what happens, because we've had so much abuse that's been probably, I don't think it's just recent. I think it's always happened. It's just been brought to the forefront. And so what can happen then is people kind of taint it with, oh, that's like marital rape. And that is not what anyone's advocating. There's got to be this sense of like a joy of coming together. And that's sort of the assumed part, is that a husband and wife would want to come together. And in 1 Corinthians 7, like, don't neglect, like the only time you wouldn't want to be together is for a time of prayer, which usually I don't think is the issue
No.
that couples are facing.
No, yeah. And so if you're not familiar with the 1 Corinthians 7, it starts in verse 2, but it says, because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband.
Mm-hmm.
The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does.
Yeah, that's wild.
Pretty clear.
That it's, I mean, really clear.
Well, and like it's equal in the sense.
Yeah.
Like there's no like the man has more
Yeah, no,
right to
absolutely
anything or the woman has more right to anything.
Mhm.
It's like you were both equally
Right.
over the others, which is like I think that's a place where people go a little bit wrong.
Mhm.
You know, they take maybe one of those verses out of context and they're like, "See, I have rights over you." And it's like, "Well,
I have rights over you.
I have rights over you too."
Yeah, right. So that's where the stalemate happens.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, this is all talking about the context of marriage, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
I think the heart of this is really getting after that when God institutes marriage,
Yeah.
that should be a sacred and protected thing
Yes.
Yeah.
at all cost. And so when you're not married, as an example, lust falls into more of the sexual morality clause,
Uh-huh.
right? Because you have no spouse to attribute your sexual desires toward,
Right.
right? And so in that case, that's got to be brought under submission of Christ
Mhm.
because you don't yet have a spouse to orient that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I don't, are you familiar? You're probably familiar with Jordan Peterson.
Sure.
And he did a whole series on Exodus,
Oh,
which
gosh.
is awesome. And in this series,
Yep.
Dennis Prager.
He
Do you know who
did.
Dennis
Oh,
Prager
I'm
is?
very familiar with this
So
too.
Dennis
Yeah.
Prager goes, "Hey, listen, Jews don't have the same standard of
Correct.
purity that you Christians do."
Correct.
And he pointed to like the thing in Matthew, if you lust after a woman in your own heart, or that is not adultery. And I was like, Dennis Prager, like love a lot of the stuff you do, but
Yeah.
you are so wrong on this issue because the Bible clearly says don't covet, and then specifically don't covet your neighbor's wife. Like that's in Deuteronomy, that's in Exodus. It's like this is not like I thought that was wild
Me too.
that he would say that, and either he's illiterate to the biblical thing, but he's biblically illiterate, or like, which I think might be the case here, which I thought was just so strange for such a scholar to not see "don't covet your neighbor's wife" as like lusting.
Yeah. So I had to go follow a couple more things that he directly talked about
Yeah.
this because there was such backlash
Right.
over this particular topic. Are you familiar with this thing,
Yeah.
Nicole? Okay. And so he goes on to say that, Jews have the sin is a physical thing that you're
Right.
doing with the exception of having idols of the heart, right? But outside of that, all the other sins that they've got are related to a physical action. And he attributes the sexual immorality in that same capacity. But he does go on to eventually say, not in that series, but at a different interview where he's challenged on this, where he says that, pornography is wrong, but he would rather a man watch pornography than to actually go commit adultery, which is a wild thing.
Sure.
But, I look at this and I go, yeah, but that I get that adultery is a literal ripping of the family apart.
Right.
There's immediate visceral consequences to adultery, whereas pornography tends to be less.
It's less overt. Like the consequences of watching pornography are
Yeah.
more subtle, more like
They are
drawn
more
out
subtle.
over time.
Right. If
Yeah.
it had an immediate ripping and rending of the family, it would be far less consumed. But because
Yeah.
it is done in private and because there's not an immediate backlash and fallout, it's far more easy for men to fall into that and fall
Right.
prey to it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that
Well,
does become a challenge.
I just thought it was weird. I mean, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife.
Yes.
To me, that is about as explicit
Fair enough.
I don't think he's meaning like I want her to make dinner for me. I think clearly
Yeah.
you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox. Now I don't think he's saying you shouldn't want to have sex with those, although you could include that because that's in the same vein,
Sure.
nor anything that belongs to your neighbor. I think it's all inclusive there, which
Yeah.
is what Jesus's point is. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting
Okay.
thing how he kind of went there.
Okay, so then if that's the direction you go with lust being a covetousness thing,
Right.
which I would
Sure.
I would certainly say that
Totally.
they're intermingled.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then what would you say to a man who says, "I'm trying to stop pornography"?
Right.
Is it wrong to masturbate if I'm thinking about my spouse?
Yeah, I see. This is where all is permissible. 1 Corinthians 10:23. All is permissible, but not all is beneficial. I think. Does she agree to that? Sure. If she agrees to it, it's like part of it. I just don't want to create a. I think for me the struggle is I don't want to create a biblical boundary where the Bible isn't specific on it.
Right.
And the principle you would say is what is better, masturbation or sex? And you'd say clearly sex because it's doing a lot of things. In fact, there's the harmful aspect of masturbation is there's a couple chemicals released in your brain. One is dopamine, like is your video game, like you want to go and do it again. That dopamine, and then there's oxytocin, or also known as the hugging hormone. And when you don't have sex with your wife, then you're not gluing yourselves together. Like although mentally you may be, you are not physically, and I think that's a super important part of it. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to create if a husband's deployed in combat and they're having a phone conversation which goes intimate. I don't want to get in the way of that. If there's a business trip, I'd rather him have some sort of and so I think that goes couple by couple specifically that they need to talk about that and have communication because his body is not his own, and so if she's not okay with that, she would say that I'm not okay with that, and that makes me feel less than or whatever. And at another place is you also want to say is this? It might be permissible, but is it beneficial? And so it might be beneficial.
Could be.
I think this is a line that again this goes into in each marriage. This is where the open communication it becomes super important because I don't want you to take a blank check from me here saying oh well he said I could so therefore I can't.
Right.
And I think what God says is using your community, all is permissible but not all is beneficial, and I think this is probably a good spot for that because I think there's a lot of what's the right word for that?
Gray area in this.
Gray area, and there's a lot of drawback or negative that could come from that sort of heart.
Yeah, and this is why I was mentioning in the very front end of this that if somebody only focused on do not masturbate,
Right.
you miss a lot of what happens in a lot of the spots that you're going to encounter where you had never thought about how to handle things. And so if you don't have a biblical framework for solving problems, it can get really legalistic. And when you're talking about masturbation and pornography or anything like that, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in just my own life that I had to unwork back in the day was when you watch pornography, they tend to be very young women, right? And so your brain gets trained to naturally go toward young women all the time. And as your wife ages, can't compete with that. Can't compete with that. Whereas when you keep your brain trained on having sex with your wife, that becomes an ever-changing stage with her. So she always remains beautiful.
Absolutely.
Always.
And and God designed your brain that way, which is
it's incredible.
Wild to think about that he's always reprogramming your brain on the current version of your wife, which then this gets into having sex with the lights on. We won't need to go into that. But there is a reality that the visual stimulation for a man comes the oxytocin release and the dopamine release becomes a super important part of it.
Yeah, and here's one of the things that I've had when I had the conversation with some of the guys about this. I said, look, if your wife's okay with this and you two are able to find a healthy way to go do this, my caution to you would be if you begin to fantasize about your wife and you now have turned the fantasy into this idealistic thing,
like a better version of your
better
wife,
version of her, then that's harmful and you should avoid that.
Yeah.
Because now you're just feeding into the pride of what you want and not actually
exactly
resolving things in a way that is just need release.
There's a couple Bible verses that come to mind. Everything that doesn't come from faith is sin. So if you're not operating to the glory of God in Christ and it's like you, and if you're feeling some sort of way about it, this goes back to like my arguments on Halloween or even Christmas. Like I feel a sense of there's darkness here, then I'd say don't do it. Only be fully convinced in something that's honoring to God. How about this? I won't be mastered by anything. Like don't go into something that might enslave you, even mentally, or
Your freedom can enslave you.
Okay, give it to me. What do you mean?
Right. Well, I mean, thinking this isn't wrong because I'm not looking at other women, so I've
Right.
got complete freedom
Right.
over this. And you go down some of these mental pathways, and it can become a new master that you're now serving, right? So you're now enslaved to the very fact that you have the freedom to go do something like that, and yet it becomes the new master over you.
Good.
And your
And also another part of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control.
Yeah.
And so love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And I think part of that is if you don't have the self-control, or maybe it's too weird for you to talk about it with your wife, this goes into another, or I'll say even husband, right? It can go both ways. Then that's problematic. So, yeah. Don't gratify the desires of the flesh, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so you do whatever you want. So self-denial, not self-gratification, but it could be like, again, this is where I just don't want to put a line on it, because who knows what kind of health situation the woman may have, and she wants to, be intimate with her husband, but she can't because of whatever reason. I think that it's just I don't want to put a hard line on that.
Yeah.
So. Talk to me, Nicole, as a woman. Is pornography is that because usually with men we're like, this is a man's thing, but from what I'm understanding, this is not purely a men's issue.
No, it's absolutely not.
So in the realm of this, how do you like with women that you talk to in ministry with, how do you help them? Like, and I'm not sure if you're having the conversation with female wives about like masturbating to their husband, but like, how do you help people see the reality of that, or first pornography, and then just, I don't know if this is something, I don't know what women talk about, but like in these terms, is that a subject that even comes up, like masturbation? Is that even a subject?
Yeah. I mean, I have several friends who've engaged in it at some point or have been tempted by it at other points. I mean, I've been tempted by it.
Mm-hmm.
I have struggles with women fantasize.
Probably not in the same way men do.
No, it's definitely not in the same way, but like, women watch porn also, but more commonly like it's books.
Oh, okay, like Daniel Steele novels. Or
yes.
whatever.
Or like really steamy rom-coms.
Right.
And like you get those images in your head, and then you kind of just continue to develop a fantasy about that.
Yeah.
And there are lots of women that struggle with that, and I would argue that is a female equivalent of watching porn.
Yeah.
So like if you're not watching porn, like anything that isn't rooted in reality is going to harm you. And anything that you're thinking about in your head isn't rooted in reality, and it's doing some kind of damage.
So what is this might be overly simplifying, but what's the solution? And I'm going to talk about just lust specifically, because I think sometimes I'm just to single people, the answer is just get married. How have we seen that play out?
I don't agree with that
all right,
at
so
all.
What do you think? What do you think? Just get married, Tony.
Okay. I think that can temporarily resolve some things, right? So again, it kind of comes back to there's a mechanical piece to disciplining the body and your actions, right? Having self-control. There's that mechanical side of things. But then there's also the heart side of things.
Right.
There does need to be a reorienting of the heart back toward a place of righteous living, not toward a self-gratifying stance, right? Which ultimately is what draws men or women into pornography. Is just, I need to be satisfied, and my needs are now preeminent. And so right now.
So if a person is struggling with pornography, is the answer just get married? Is that going to work for them?
No.
Probably not.
Why not?
Probably
because you're still going to be tempted by pornography even if you're married.
Right, and I think that's more of the, I don't want to, this is
like marriage doesn't solve problems.
it only
it
amplifies
exacerbates them.
Yeah.
So it, like, if you're struggling with watching porn, if you're struggling
just
with
get married. It's going to solve it all.
No, getting married is not going to solve it all.
Okay.
I would actually challenge those people to first heal from whatever it is that is driving them towards this thing, and not get married until they feel like they're in a healthier place.
Right. I think if you're going to think that solving your pornography issue is I now have somebody to have sex with, that's going to be problematic, right? I think we could all go, that's a bad idea.
Well, and it's not only like the amount of damage that will do to you as a person, but also to your spouse. Like,
especially if you bring that into the marriage.
Yeah, especially if you bring that into the marriage. It's just like, I've heard that from so many women, and I can only imagine. Like, I know that it can go the other way also. Like, if a man doesn't feel like desired by his wife, like that can be really harmful. So
absolutely can.
Yeah.
But we know this anecdotally that hookup culture has proven that just because you physically have sex does not remove a lustful heart.
Right.
Right.
It amplifies it.
It amplifies
yeah.
it.
It amplifies it. So,
and I think the reality of like non-covenantal sex, and I'm not gonna like this goes into now we're in my theory, but I think this is true. Non-covenantal sex, which is transactional, is very appealing because it's you are performing for me and I am performing for you, and if at any moment my performance doesn't measure up, then the other person has the right to get out. And we're talking about sex, the most intimate thing you possibly, it's like saying the most intimate thing. And what's wild about it is that you're then sort of like, then you sort of expect that when married sex would be the same performance conditioned sex.
Yes.
And it's just not.
Amen.
Because there is no, now, in a covenantal Christian relationship, maybe in a non-Christian relationship, it's still like I'm performing because I have to, and they could leave at any time. But there is something that shifts, and so if you go from a transactional relationship to a covenantal one because you're like, oh, I want to do this right, I want to get married and make it Christian, be prepared that the sex is not going to be the same, and it's going to be very different, and you're going to have the thrill will not be the same because you're not seeing like, is this pleasing to this person, and are they going to stay with me? I think that part is gone.
Yeah. Okay, so I have had conversation with guys where they're upset that their wife doesn't want to engage all the time.
Right.
But she's willing.
Right.
And so she might say something like, okay, I'm here, have at it. And he's like, well, I don't want to now because like you're not engaged. You don't want, and I'm like, you moron. You don't understand. She is giving you your conjugal rights so that you are not tempted to go somewhere else.
Right.
And so to your point, I think that when you're dating, you're having sex outside of the confines of marriage, it's always like going out to a nice dinner, right? Whereas when you're in marriage, it's like, you know what? Fast food. It's good sometimes.
Right.
Right? Not everything needs to be a 3-course meal.
That's right.
And so you gotta understand that, like,
I put sex in 3 categories. You got fast food, home cooked meal, and 7-course dinner. And I think there are times
this is
for
so interesting.
Yeah, there's times for each. And I
but
think,
you know what? But think about this. It's okay. I'm going to use the same eating metaphor. It's better to eat fast food at home than to go to HEB hungry,
right,
looking at other women.
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
I mean, ultimately, this is some of the stuff that like triggers with guys. Is they're like, especially now that like yoga pants are a thing, which is basically just. I mean, I'm just saying, it's pretty darn close to nudity. It's pretty darn close. Let me put it to you this way: if you put a quarter in your pocket and I can tell whether it's heads or tails, probably not appropriate.
Oh wow,
it's probably not appropriate.
That's a good.
So
it's a good measure of that.
And so it's just it's a challenge because it's like, okay, you can see everything.
Right.
That stuff's not hiding anything.
Right.
I know it's comfy, but like for men, it's a real stimulant.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of these guys that are struggling with this, I'm like, you need to understand if your wife is willing to help you in this way, take the help.
Yeah.
Like you don't need to fight this battle on your own.
Right. I agree. Yeah. Yoga pants. Thoughts?
I wear them. I didn't think it was a problem.
I know you don't, but you also aren't necessarily visually stimulated. The same way
you're
guys
right.
are,
You're right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that perspective.
Yeah.
I've never. I mean, I've heard of that. Like I've heard of my friends saying that men have said to them, but no guy has ever said that so directly.
Yeah,
to me in a conversation with me that I've just been able to kind of be like, oh sure, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, dressing modestly is a moving scale. right?
Yeah.
With culture. But,
Yep.
you know, it's one of those that I've even had to have conversations with ladies in our small group around like, okay, I need you to understand, dress a little more modestly.
Yeah.
There are men who struggle with lust a lot in this community group or in, you know, this setting.
Yep.
And so do they need to control themselves? You bet. This is their sin. They must
Yeah.
submit this to Christ. 100%. But a big part of living within a Christian community is also going, okay, how do I bear your burden?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there is the
Absolutely.
side of like, if a woman can understand, if I'm going to be in a community, if I can do something to help you not fall prey to this, then
Yeah.
that's a great thing. Like, that's not just my wife's responsibility. Right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's one of the
okay.
most loving things that you could do for the men around
Absolutely.
you.
I will even say that is something that I try to do in dating also. Like,
That's great.
I'm very conscious of what I wear when I go on a date. Obviously, I
Yeah.
want to look nice.
Yep.
But I always ask myself, like, is this, am I showing too much? You know,
Yeah,
is this appropriate? Especially the more I get to know someone, and like most men have some kind of struggle with lust to varying degrees.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so, you know, especially if I know that the guy that I'm going on a date with is having a especially hard time, like I will do all the things, and it's out of love. Like it's out
Yes.
of love for another person that you do that, you know? Like if if one of my girlfriends is struggling with lust, like we're not going to go watch a rom-com together. We're not, you know, I'm going to hold her accountable to not read things or whatever, you know.
Yep.
We're not going to go to places where you might see guys shirtless or something.
Yeah.
And so like if I would do that for one of my girlfriends, I'm going to do the same for the men in my life also.
That's great. I love that perspective. 'Cause
Yeah.
It's not as common as I would hope to hear.
Yeah.
And
No,
I
I know.
think, and I think partly one, I think sometimes women have, it's your deal, get over it, and it is true.
It is true.
It is
It
very
is my
much
deal.
true. But at the same time, if you love someone, then you're gonna have to.
But it's such a prideful thing to say my preferences are more important than your
We
righteousness.
live in such a hypersexualized culture
Oh, yeah.
that these guys, like the men in this church, the men who are like actively trying to do better, are getting hit with this left and right everywhere they go.
Yeah, not
Like
just
you
this church.
cannot
any
turn
church.
on the TV without some kind of stimulation. You can't drive down the road without some kind of stimulation. So if there are one or two places that they can go every week where they know that I'm not going to have to worry about this as much, the temptation isn't going to be as strong, like what a relief that would be for them,
Yep.
for those men that are struggling with that.
Yeah,
Like
and-
they have a safe haven that they can come to. In the same way that a woman coming into a church setting knows that she's not going to be abused, you know, that knows that she's not going to be in danger.
Right.
Like I feel safe here.
Good.
That's what that is. And it's the same way with men. It looks very different because men are very different, but it's the same thing. We want them to feel safe and loved and cared for when they're here.
At the same time, I think I'd say I'm not going to enforce a dress code, like, oh, your
Yeah.
shorts are too short, because you want
No,
people to be
absolutely.
able to come as they are. At the same time, this is where the conversation of especially, I think that there's a like, hey, random person, let me tell you how to dress, versus
Gotta have a relationship.
hey, relationship person that I have with you, let me
Yeah.
help you know what's going on because I know you care about me and I care about you.
Yeah.
I think in the past, and this is where, you know, the straw man argument. I think in the past it's either gone wear whatever, you know, and then that's problematic. And then on the flip side, it's been draconian on like, hey, floor length dresses is all that you can wear, and then it prevents the place being like a place for people who aren't who are at a different spot in life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also presumes that just because you dress in a modest way, that men will not still lust.
Right. Yeah.
Which, I mean, you could wear a burlap sack and a guy would still figure out a way to lust if that was like the state of his heart.
Right.
And so there is an
That's
element
so
of this
good.
that is like, that is 100% his sin that he has to own, regardless of what you wear. But if there is a way for you to make it easier for him to not mentally undress, then
Nice.
that should
Help
be
him out.
aimed for,
Help
right?
brother
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
That's
Anyway,
good.
This is all coming back to the
Yeah.
masturbation and fantasies kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
right?
yeah. Don't create fantasies for people.
if possible.
if possible.
Yeah.
Man. And I think that the biggest part of that is if you're not thinking that way. This is the part where I'm now trying to speak for a woman. It might be impossible, but if you're not thinking that direction, maybe that's easier. Like, I'm not making myself into a sex object. I'm, at the same time, you want to look, kind of to your point, I want to be nice, presentable, all those kind of things, but you're not creating I don't know, you could be wearing a sweater and still come off with a vibe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we need to have everyone kind of going around with an angry face or anything, but there is a reality that, to your point, it's not just what you wear, it's the way you come off, which can be, problematic. Anyway.
Yeah.
We've gone a full circle on this one.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, if you got any questions, make sure you text at 737-231-0605. Love to answer your question. We've talked about sex gazillions of times, whether it's about heterosexuality, homosexuality, trans. We've kind of gone the entire gamut, so it's not like we're afraid to touch that. So let us know what you think. Send us a text, 737-231-0605, or go to pastorplek.com. We'd love to hear from you. And hey, thanks for watching, listening, and from our house to yours, have an awesome week of worship.